first question that we have is, when did you first hear of Yemeni coffee, and what was your first experience of it? I mean, between the three of you, you've got many, many years of experience in the coffee world. Yemen is something of an obscurity, and I think that for many of us who are intimate with Yemen, we knew about it, but it had no real commercial traction, and certainly not until recent years in the specialty world. So I'm going to ask you, John, because after me, you're the oldest, and we'll let seniority by age lead off. So over to you, and then I'm sure that Alan and Marty will join in and add their own texture. Thanks a lot.
No, you're welcome. Thank you, and it's a kind of dubious pleasure. But yeah, if I go back to kind of the beginning of my coffee career, I used to work for the Betty's and Taylor's group, and so even going back to the beginning of my time there, I worked in the quality assurance department, working on shifts, tasting coffees that were coming through the roasting system. And Taylor's as a business, they're really well known for their supermarket coffee, but also there's a group of cafes in Yorkshire, Betty's Tea Rooms, very traditional tea rooms, but really high quality, both in the food, but also in the tea and the coffee. And part of their offering were kind of unique and interesting coffees that were kind of not so well known around the world. And one of them was Yemeni coffee. But going back then, sort of obviously one of my jobs was to get to know the flavor profiles, but then also to understand them and then be able to assess them in terms of quality. So when the roasts came out, kind of we could say if they were on standard or not. And the Yemeni coffee was always really uniquely different, kind of had this strange gamey profile to it, and kind of really stood out from kind of your very typical kind of maybe washed kind of Central American profiles that we used a lot of. But the coffee was a little bit more inconsistent then. It was hard to get hold of, and sort of it was very hard to get traceability information on it. So we would get coffees coming in. We sold them as generally as Yemeni Ismaili coffee, sort of one of the generic names, sort of near the city of Sana'a, that type of profile. And sometimes they would come in bags marked as Matari, sometimes as Arazi, but kind of the quality was a little bit inconsistent as well, and it was very, very hard to source, so it could actually be, rather than being able to get product in an annual year to make sure you got really fresh coffee, actually it could be 18, 20 months before you could get a hold of some. So it was really hard to manage as I moved up into the buying role to know when you could and couldn't get hold of it. And I think that's one of the amazing things over the last, I think even 5 or 6 years, is to see how things have really changed and how Yemeni coffee has become a fixture, and it's readily accessible, and buyers are much more aware of being able to source it on a year in, year out basis. So that's my experience.
I mean, I think that Marty has a deep interest in Yemeni coffee, and he has Arabic, and has an interest in the people as well as their product. Marty's a completely different generation to me, and he comes to coffee very fresh, as does the Asian market, which is where he's based. There are no presuppositions because it's a tea culture, whether it's pu'er or green tea. But over the last 10 years, when I've been traveling, Marty, to China with Elva and her team, it's changed from not being able to get a good cup of coffee to getting wonderful cups of coffee, and some of the best in the world now. And it's just exploded. So how did you get to know about Yemeni coffee, Marty?
Yeah, so I started hearing about Yemeni in 2013, and from Dr. Manuel Diaz. He was teaching a class here in China, and he had just finished working on a project in Yemen, so he was very excited about it. He had a bunch of samples with him, and we cupped all these samples, and they were just outrageous. I mean, outrageous both in good and bad ways. We had a lot of different experiences with those coffees, and it was just such a different flavor profile than I'd ever experienced before. And you mentioned being interested in the people. It's partly also due to Manuel, who's an anthropologist. We talked a lot about how the culture of coffee cultivation in Yemen is so different than anywhere else in the world. And obviously the profile is totally different. The varietals are totally different. And back then there was even, I mean, there's still little known about Yemeni coffee now, but back then it was even less. And so at that point I just said, well, I should go check it out. So took about a year to figure out how to get a visa because it's not a normal thing to do. So we went to Egypt and Jordan and kind of all around trying to figure out how to work out visas, and finally figured it out. So went to Yemen in 2014 and visited some mills and cupped a lot of coffee and met a lot of producers and a lot of different exporters. And from there, it just became a personal passion, just to see in what way Yemeni coffee could reemerge as an important player in the specialty coffee world. And I knew also, as you mentioned, that China would be a receptive market, because these wild and crazy flavors that you can find in Yemen aren't at all, not only not offensive in the East Asian market, they're really oftentimes quite sought after. And people don't have 50 years or 100 years of coffee ought to be this way or that way experience. They're quite possibly the first coffee they try is a crazy funky natural, and then they know that there's Colombian and Guatemalan wash coffees out there. And so the general acceptance level for naturals in general and for wild naturals is really high here. And so watching kind of the emergence of specialty naturals as a concept around the world, and then Yemenis finally being able to actually be sourced and have some semblance of traceability and some semblance of understanding of what they are, has just been a super, super cool journey to watch. And yeah, look forward to going back. Probably won't be anytime in the very, very near future, but yeah, it's been a very interesting couple of years watching Yemeni coffee develop.
Well, good. It's very, very interesting, and it sounds as though your journey is, to a certain extent, a parallel to Sheba. It's good to have somebody who's as passionate and is informed with us on that journey. Your experiences of Yemen, have you been there yourself, or
No, I haven't had the pleasure yet. I hope it will come in the near future. My first experience with the Yemen coffee actually comes when I took my Q-grader exam. So we're talking about 2013 or 14, if I remember correctly. So at that stage, I do not recall experiencing Yemeni coffees before. So we just had this wonderful coffee on the table on the first 3 days when we were practicing, and everyone scored it really high. It was in the 90s, and everyone was blown away by the complexity of the coffee, and the acidity in there was absolutely outstanding. And as I said, it scored really high. And then at the end, when the instructor let us know that actually it was a Yemeni, I was like, hold on a second, I work in the coffee industry for 7-8 years now, and I do not recall actually trying Yemeni before. So that was kind of a mind-blowing event for me, and that's why even now I can pinpoint it, that Yemeni charmed me at the very beginning when I met it, and once that I finished the course and I went back to work, I started to try to outsource this, find the coffee, and for a while I could find only kind of a commercial Yemenis, like from the very big producers, and only in the later years I started to find Yemen in the small independent roasters with high quality coffees, which was kind of again a really rewarding experience for me, because I knew that they had potential, and for a couple of years I couldn't find a Yemen as good as that Yemen that I had on the table back then. And finally, after a few years, yeah, I started again to meet those high quality, complex, winey coffees, and that was again a sign that that's an origin that has potential, So yeah, this is I might have tried it before and just probably not it wasn't nothing remarkable about it. But my first experience that I very clearly can recall is during the Q course, again in 2013 or 14, something like that. Yeah. And since then, I had the pleasure, especially in the last years, to work with specialty Yemeni, and I was surprised with how consistently good they can be if they are processed properly. So yeah, definitely one of my favorite origins.
Before we move on to the next question, I think that something needs to be said about Yemen is that it's a unique landscape. The architecture, culture, the visuals are simply stunning, and it's easy to get trapped in the mystique, the land of Sheba, and get drawn in, particularly for us Westerners, to that allure, and then turn off our critical radar for the coffee in the cup. And I know that for myself, as a devotee of Yemeni coffee, I sometimes have to take a step back and realize that this is competing with coffees from other origins across the Red Sea, in Africa. There are lots of high altitude locations. And Yemen has to stand out for all sorts of reasons that we will come to later on in terms of logistics and arising costs.